Hello everyone, welcome to our very first bio lesson. Our first topic will be the characteristics of living things. The objectives that we will be covering include explaining the difference between living and non-living things. We will also list the 7 characteristics of life. We will define and explain the terms nutrition, respiration, excretion, movement, reproduction, growth, and irritability. We will then differentiate between breathing and respiration, as well as excretion and egestion. Now that we've listed all our objectives, let's flow right into it and differentiate between a living and a non-living thing. A living thing is an organism that is made up of chemical units called cells. Now, how can we differentiate between organisms that are living and objects? How do I know that a stick is non-living? How do I know that a car is non-living? How do I know that a piece of sponge is non-living? Why is it that we say a tiger is living? Why are humans living? What is different between the tiger and the car? Well, first of all, living things must display 7 integral characteristics, and they are listed to the left of your screen. Now, in order for an organism to be described as being living, they must display these 7 characteristics, which are excretion, growth, reproduction, the ability to respond to stimuli, they must be able to feed, they must be able to move, and they must respire. Now, say for example, we have a car, and I want to know if the car is living or non-living. We all know that cars are not living, but let's look at the reasons why. What features do the car have that makes it non-living? Can the car excrete? Yes. The car does release gases that has been produced from different reactions from the fuels that it has been given. Can the car grow? No. Can the car reproduce? No. Can the car respond to stimuli? Yes. Can the car feed? No. Can the car move? Yes. Can the car respire? No. Now let's summarize. So the car can excrete, the car can respond, the car can move, but the car cannot respire, the car cannot grow, the car cannot reproduce, the car cannot feed. Therefore, the car is not living. The car is a non-living thing. In order for it to be a living thing, it must display all 7 characteristics, not 6, not 5, all 7. Now, with that said, let's move on and look at our first characteristic, which is movement. Now, movement is the ability to change the position of either a part of an organism or the entire organism, the whole body of the organism. The organism may need to move for different reasons. They may want to search for food, they may want to grow, they may need to escape danger or move to favorable conditions. Now, when animals move from one place to another, it is called locomotion. But plants cannot locomote. Plants are rooted, so they have to stay in one place. And furthermore, they have no legs, so they can't move. But plants display what we call growth movements, right? They move towards light, and that is called phototropism. When they move towards gravity, it is called geotropism. When they move towards water, it is called hydrotropism. And when they move in response to touch, it is called nastic movements. Now, nastic movements is displayed by a plant that many people in Jamaica and probably in the Caribbean as well are familiar with. It's called the Mimosa pudica, more commonly known as the touch me not or the shame old lady. And it is displayed to the right of your screen. You can see a finger being projected towards it, and the leaflet, the small leaf, is moving, right? If this was a moving picture, you'd be better able to see how the plant responds. But basically, the plant will move away from the direction of stimuli. So we all need to move. We all need to get from one place to another or move in response to some kind of situation. Maybe there is danger. And that brings us to our next characteristic, because we cannot move without energy. And the next characteristic that we will be looking at is one that liberates or releases energy, and that is respiration. Respiration involves the release of energy from food, and the food material specifically that we are talking about is glucose. Now, have you ever wondered why is it that if you skip a meal or you miss breakfast, you start to feel fatigued, tired, weak, drowsy, like you just can't go anymore? You feel like you can't move and you can't make it another step, right? That is because the food that you would have eaten or that you should have eaten would be broken down, and glucose from the food would be used to release energy. And that is the energy that gives you the strength to do all the activities that you would have been doing in your regular life. Now, every single activity that you do requires some amount of energy, right? We use energy even when we're sitting, when we're sleeping. In order for your heart to continue beating, energy is used, right? Once that energy stops being produced, then eventually death will occur, because we need energy to walk around. We need energy to think. We need energy for our brains to work. We need energy for our hearts to beat. So without energy, we won't be able to survive. No process at all, no reaction will happen at all. Now, respiration is of two forms. It may either be aerobic, which requires the presence of oxygen, and it may also be anaerobic, which does not require oxygen. Now, important to note, respiration is not the same thing as breathing. Breathing is simply inhalation and exhalation, but respiration is the release of energy from food. Now, respiration is dependent on breathing, because we need to take in oxygen to break down the glucose molecule to release energy during aerobic respiration. But respiration can also occur without oxygen. So in that case, it is not entirely dependent on breathing. The two are linked, but they are not the same. Breathing involves exchanging gases between the body and the environment, but respiration incorporates some of that gas in breaking down glucose. Now, when we come to respiration as a topic, we will look further at what happens during aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now let's move on to our next characteristic, which is sensitivity and irritability. Now, sensitivity is the ability to respond to a stimuli, and a stimuli is any signal that brings about a change or a response. Now, over here to the right of the screen, you are seeing a little cycle between the stimulus and the response. So generally what happens is that you detect a change, or you are exposed to the stimulus, right? And that elicits, it brings about the response, and then the body would go back to its normal condition. But this will continue because you will always be exposed to different stimuli, and it will always bring about a response. In animals, this cycle is controlled by an intricate system called the nervous system, right? And the nervous system is very fast acting and accurate. It helps us to escape danger by detecting these stimuli. It helps us to find a mate. It also helps to regulate a constant internal environment, maintaining the conditions of the body, the normal conditions of the body. But plants don't have a nervous system. They detect changes in a different way. They use chemical substances called hormones. Now, I don't want you to worry about this, because we will come to hormones a little bit later down in this series. Now, humans have sense organs, specifically the eye, ear, the nose, the mouth, and the skin. And they all detect different stimuli. The eye detects light, the ear detects sound, the nose detects smell, the mouth, specifically the tongue, detects taste or different flavors, and the skin detects touch. Sensitivity will be further discussed under the topics nervous system and response to stimuli, where we will look at the differences between responses seen in plants and responses seen in animals. Now let's continue by looking at our next characteristic, which is growth. Have you ever wondered why the top layer of your skin keeps peeling off or strips off? Have you ever wondered why your hair grows, why your fingernails grow? And have you ever wondered how is it that your skin heals and closes every time you get a wound? Well, that is because of a process known as cell division. And cell division facilitates growth. Now, growth is a permanent increase in both size and complexity. So as the individual grows, they get bigger and more complex and more mature. Now, when cells get damaged or worn out, they have to be replaced, and whatever is replacing them has to be an exact copy of what they were. So when the top layer of your skin peels away, that is because the cells there are now worn out. They have done their time and it's time to replace them, which is fairly regularly, right? So you will see the top layer of your skin peeling away, or if you scratch it, you will see that it flares up. That is because the dead cells are now at the top layer, and below it a new layer of cells form. Now, this is facilitated by division. So the cells divide, and the more they divide is the more cells that will be present. The more cells that is present, the larger the organism will be, and these cells also grow. So cell enlargement occurs. Now, when we have cells and they are constantly dividing, eventually they come together to form a layer of tissues, and then tissues will come together to form organs, and that is the basis on which an organism develops and an organism grows. Now, if the amount of cells being created at a specific time is greater than the number of cells being broken down, the number of worn out cells that are being replaced or removed from the body, then growth will be achieved, right? So let's go over that again. If the building up, that is the making of new cells, is greater than the breaking down or removal of old worn out cells, then growth will be achieved. Now, if we look to the right of the screen, you will see the developmental process of a frog. So the frog started out as a single cell, and this single cell started to divide. It became enlarged, and eventually it developed into a tissue. And this continued until it formed organs, which resulted in different body parts being formed. So here we have legs being formed, and we have more legs being formed. We are seeing now eyes, and the tail is getting more defined as well. Now the organism continues to develop, continues to get bigger until it's even more complex than it was in the beginning. It is significantly different. It has differentiated so much, it looks completely different. It has changed in size, it has changed in complexity, its appearance is different, so it looks different, and it can carry out different roles. So before, as a single cell, it wouldn't have been able to do much, but now with arms and legs and eyes and a functioning tongue, it can be able to do different things in the environment. Now let's move on to our next characteristic, which is reproduction. Now, I'm sure many of you as a child may have asked your parents, "Mommy, Daddy, how did I get here? Where did I come from? How was I formed?" And your parents may have hesitated in telling you the truth. By now, you should know the truth. And we know that new organisms or new individuals are produced by a process called reproduction. Now, reproduction is not essential for the survival of one individual, but it is essential for the survival of a species. What do I mean by that? Well, to be honest, it is more important for the entire species to continue, but it is not as important for one individual in the population to continue. So the population is not limited by one individual. So say, for example, if one individual in the population is not able to reproduce, maybe because of some form of dysfunction or they have some sort of problem, that does not define the entire species, because the species on a whole is a reproducing species. So if one woman in the human population or a few women in the human population cannot reproduce, that does not mean they are not living, because the species is a reproducing species, and in general, things can be done to help that individual to reproduce. So they are still living, even if a woman is not able to carry a child. She doesn't define the entire species. Now, there are two types of reproduction. One is called asexual reproduction. The other is called sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction occurs when an offspring is produced with the use of gametes. Now, gametes are sex cells. For example, the egg and the sperm. But how can an organism reproduce without the egg or the sperm? They may divide, so they may copy their genetic information and they split into two organisms. Or farmers do this all the time. They take a leafy stem from a plant, place it in different solutions to help it to grow and to nourish it, and then a new plant grows. Some plants naturally produce younger offsprings on them, which then fall off to form or grow into a new organism. But we'll come to asexual reproduction in details when we come to the topic of reproduction. Sexual reproduction is the production of an offspring by the joining of the sex cells or gametes. So, as is depicted to the right of your screen, we see a sperm cell penetrating, going into the egg cell. And once it gets in, the genetic information of the sperm will fuse with the genetic information of the egg, thereby producing a baby. Now let us continue with our remaining characteristics. Excretion is the removal of metabolic wastes from the body of the organism. The word metabolic simply means that it was involved in some sort of chemical process had occurred in the body. So some sort of chemical change has taken place. These substances, if allowed to accumulate, may harm the organism. So they will hurt the organism in some way if we allow them to collect or to accumulate in the area. It is important to note, however, that excretion is not the same thing as egestion. As mentioned before, in order for it to be excretion, a metabolic process must have occurred and produced some form of waste. But egestion is the removal of undigested food material. So when we consume food and the food substance is broken down in the stomach during digestion, whatever the body cannot digest will pass out through the anus, and that is egestion. Since it has passed out and it was not broken down, it could not have participated in any metabolic reaction, and so that waste material wasn't excreted, it was egested. Now, some excretory organs include the leaf and bark of plants, the skin, the kidneys, the lungs of animals, right? And some waste substances include carbon dioxide, urea in animals, salts, water, and there are many, many more. Now, to the right of your screen, you're seeing a leaf with some white crystals on it. This is a mangrove plant, and what is on the surface is dried salt crystals that have been excreted through small holes on the surface of the leaf called stomata. Now, the plant had taken in salt water through its roots, and some of this salt water had participated in metabolic reactions. Now, the salt was extracted and was released as a waste product, and it is excreted through the surface of the leaf and settled on the surface, after which the water was removed and the crystals dried on the leaf. Now we will come to excretion when we will look at the different methods of excretion a little bit more detailed and focus on mainly excretion in animals. Now let us continue with our presentation. And we are now looking at nutrition or feeding. Now this is the intake of food into the body. And notice I said intake and not eating of food, because not all organisms eat food. Some of them have to produce their own food. So animals generally take in complex solid food substances through their mouth parts, and this is broken down in the digestive system into more simple substances that the body can absorb and use. But what about plants? They don't have a mouth, they cannot chew, they cannot digest. How do they feed? How do they nourish their body? Well, plants are called autotrophs, and this means that they have the ability to make their own food. So plants are able to do this via a process called photosynthesis. And in photosynthesis, they take in simple inorganic substances and make more complex organic material. So plants carry out photosynthesis and they make food, and the primary food material that they make is glucose. Sounds familiar? We mentioned glucose during respiration, and we said that respiration liberates energy from the glucose molecule. So feeding is very important in energy production, because without feeding, there will be no food material, no glucose for energy to be released. And the plant, after producing glucose, can now convert it to different forms. It may convert it to other carbohydrates such as starch and sucrose, and it may also convert it to proteins or fats. Now it is able to do this because of different nutrients and mineral ions that it's taking from the soil. So for example, it will make proteins by incorporating nitrates taken from the soil, and nitrates are just some nitrogen containing compounds taken from the soil, and they are incorporated into the glucose molecule. So the molecule will be broken up and reorganized to form proteins, and so on. So with that said, let us summarize all that we have done and look at all 7 characteristics in a simplified way. Now this should help us remember all 7 characteristics in an easy way. We've devised a mnemonic, Mrs. Gren. Now the M in Mrs. stands for movement, the R stands for respiration, the S is for sensitivity, the G is for growth, the R is for reproduction, the E is for excretion, and the N is for nutrition. So we should have no problem remembering all 7 characteristics. Now that's it for today. I'll see you next time when we will look at classifying living things.